On this week's episode of Scaffolds, I talked to Dr. David Crowder. If you remember a couple episodes ago, I was talking about some papers from his lab on woolly apple aphid. Well, I finally got him on the podcast, and we discuss a decision aid support tool that he directs for the Washington state tree fruit industry. It was a really fun and interesting conversation, and I think the tool is worth checking out. It is linked in the show notes. After that conversation, we hear from Kerik about powdery mildew. And then last but not least, we have our State of the State update on degree day accumulation and trap captures. Okay, so today I'm here with Dr. David Crowder. He is an associate professor of entomology at Washington State University, where his lab works on applied insect ecology. Hello, Dr. Crowder.
Hello, Monique. How's it going?
It is going well. It's so fun to have someone from Washington State on with us today. And so we actually decided that we were going to have a conversation about the decision support tool that you developed for the Washington State tree fruit industry. And so first, I'd like you to explain a little bit about what a decision support tool is.
Well, a decision support tool, in my mind, could be anything that we try to use to help farmers, producers, or other partners in the agricultural industry make decisions to help their operations be more profitable and sustainable. In our case, our decision aid system, what we call it, is an online platform that uses weather data and runs those weather data through a series of models to kind of deliver real-time information to farmers on what's going on in their farm and provide forecasts as well to help them make decisions about insects, pathogens, horticultural disorders, other factors such as that.
So it sounds similar to Cornell's NEWA. Do you guys have like weather stations and stuff?
It is similar in a way to NEWA. We have a different platform than you all do. But yes, we have a network of over 250 weather stations in Washington state. We also have a nationwide grid of weather networks, and we can run what we call virtual weather stations pretty much anywhere in the country. We have focused on the Pacific Northwest, but we also work up in Canada and down into California and we're expanding into some other states in the Midwest. So we do have a network of physical weather stations that are pulling in data on temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, other weather variables, very similarly to NEWA. We run those data, and I know you mentioned that you give out degree day information on your podcast. So we have over 45 different models in the tree fruit system. About 30 of them are phenology models, everything from bloom of different types of apples and pears, blueberry. We have a lot of different insect models for things like codling moth, oblique-banded leaf roller, navel orange worm, apple maggot. And then we also run models of things such as fire blight, powdery mildew disease. We have models for sunburn, and we even have models for beneficial species such as how active will honeybees be on your orchard today? How active will your natural enemies be? And so we're trying to give out a lot of different information to growers to help them make decisions by integrating weather data through models.
I'm assuming that you focused a lot on the insect side of that development, being that that's your expertise. So what are your thoughts about the current state of models being used with really changing weather patterns? What are you guys seeing in Washington State?
Well, first off, I would like to say that I am by far not the only person that has created this system. I took over as the director in 2021, but the development of the models in Washington has been going on since the early 2000s, really. And I think Washington was one of the first states really that tried to get growers to use these degree day tools to really help manage their orchards. Now, in terms of your question, I think phenology models are very accurate, and I think they can tend to be very stable over time. It's not an insect trait that evolves that rapidly or that quickly. And so climate change may affect the phenology of the insects as they adapt over time, but it's not something that we really worry about on the year to year. But What is important, I think, is that the weather is very different from year to year. And that's something that's we're trying to convey to the growers, that the actual phenological stages of the insects might be very different in 2024 than in 2023. And as an example, in 2023, we had one of the coldest springs that we've actually had in a long time in Washington. But then in the month of May, we had one of the warmest Mays that we've ever had. And so our codling moth, which is one of our main insect pests, a lot of the growers were thinking, hey, this is going to be really delayed based on the weather they were getting through April. And if we weren't running these forecasts in May that telling them, hey, things are going to really ramp up in May, this is going to be kind of a quicker May than you've ever had in the past, they may not have been ready to get their management actions in place. In 2024, we've had more of kind of a middle ground year, but we actually like to give growers data not only on what's going on this year, but we tell them how this year compares to the last 5 years. They can get forecasts up to 42 days in advance. And so I think with our system, we're not thinking about climate change as much as how do you adapt to the year-to-year variability in weather, which obviously is changing more and more due to climate change. But our phenology models in general tend to be fairly stable from year to year. The final point I will make, though, and I've seen this in other decision aid systems, and it's something that we've tried to avoid, is that we've really made a focus on having models that have been developed and validated in the Pacific Northwest. I see other decision aid sites where, maybe we're in the Pacific Northwest, but we're running a model that was developed in Europe. And never validated in our local kind of environment. And I think those models can get you into trouble if you just assume that population of an insect is, completely static across its entire range. So every model that we do have on our site has been locally validated with data collected in Pacific Northwest orchards to make sure that, we're not making an error and saying transferring one of your models from New York to the Pacific Northwest, but it's not going to work.
Yeah, I think we have a big issue with that on the East Coast, where the New York models are being used in the Southeast, and it's just a totally different environment with very different climatic variables. So,
Yes, and even in the Pacific Northwest, we have a standard phenology model for the codling moth, but it is affected both by elevation and latitude. So if we were going to run our system, say, down in Utah, which is a question we've been asked, we would have to make some corrections to the model, and we have to make some small tweaks to the model even to run it up in Canada. So, the models are not different populations or metapopulations of insects will have slightly different phenology. And I think you can run into trouble if you transfer things from one place to another kind of willy-nilly.
so what do those model alterations look like? And in terms of validating, when you say validate the model, and in what way are they validated?
So I think the most common thing that we have to adjust to make a model transferable from one area to another is whether or not there's a biofix and when that biofix is actually occurring. So a biofix is, as your listeners probably know, a biological event where kind of we start counting the degree days. And in the case of the codling moth, we have a pretty important measurement of, when the first generation of adults start flying or when that first generation of eggs start being laid. And so we've seen that along elevational and latitudinal gradients that degree day threshold where we need to start counting, where the population really starts developing, can change a little bit. That, the more southern latitudes, we see things happening a little bit earlier along the degree day spectrum. In terms of validation, there's a couple different ways that you can build these phenology models. I think a very traditional way is to use laboratory assays of insects that are measured how fast they develop at different temperatures in the lab or greenhouse setting, and then kind of build a model based on how fast we think it takes to get from one stage to the other in terms of heat units. And then you have to go out, ideally in orchards or other field settings that are unmanaged because, management can obviously make it difficult to measure the population development and collect data on when those stages are out there. So phenology models are actually quite intensive. There's a fairly standard way to build them, but in terms of management, you might have to have a grad student or a postdoc out there 4 or 5 days a week collecting data on all the different stages of the insects that are in the orchards and trying to fit that up to the model you've built based on lab data. The other way that we do it is we collect long-term sampling data from many, many different orchards that are provided to us by, in many cases, commercial partners that are running tens of thousands of acres and have hundreds or thousands of traps out there. And they feed us data on the insects that they're collecting, the different stages, and then we try to match up those data to the weather data that we have at those sites and build a phenology model kind of based on field sampling data.
So, amongst the insects, which models do you think are the most important? Is it really just the internal LEPs, or do you guys have other models that you think are something that is regularly dependent on the insect side?
I think it's the leps mostly in tree fruits in Washington. It's codling moth. It's a bleak-banded leaf roller. As well, we also have a Western cherry fruit fly, which seems to be a pretty important model. In pears, a couple years ago, we, along with colleagues in Wenatchee, which is one of our experimental stations that's owned by Washington State University, there was the development of a pear psylla model, and that is by far the most critical model in pears. And so apples, it's definitely the leps and the fruit fly, and then pear psylla has become really a critical model because that's an insect that growers spend upwards of $1,500 an acre to control in Washington State.
So, have there been any differences, in the development of that model, since that's for a hemipteran or a piercing sucking insect with a different type of life cycle? Were there any nuances or differences in developing that model versus one for lepidopterans?
I think, with codling moth, they have fairly discrete generation. We've also developed a model for a Colorado potato beetle. This is in another system, but that's an insect that has really, really discrete generations. Parasilla is, as well as other insects that are faster developing, like aphids, have really overlapping generations in a lot of cases. And, the overall process is the same, but it can be a little bit tricky, if you're building a model that has an insect with very discrete generations with one where everything is overlapping. The modeling techniques and the types of distributions that you use are slightly different, but overall the process is fairly standard, I would say. In all these cases, these phenology models, we're only using temperature data, so they're fairly process-driven models, fairly straightforward. I think the actual models on our system that are the more out of the box are things like for honeybees or other diseases where there's a lot more weather factors that are actually driving the dynamics of the populations.
So, one final question. Do you think we'll ever get a model for woolly apple aphid?
We might. I mean, they are a tricky insect, as you know. I think because of how they kind of cluster together, it can be really difficult to even see the different life stages that they're emerging. I'm with woolly apple aphid, as with some of our other aphids, the place to start might be just assuming that they just have one kind of continuous long generation. I know that's not the case, but they're reproducing so much that the model that might be important for woolly apple aphid is just when do they really start colonizing the orchards? When do they start coming out of the root layer? When might you need to start making some of those first treatments? In many of our models, I think the most important thing to just tell the growers is like, when is that population starting its development? Because they're going to be spraying throughout the year for the insect. And Our goal is not to eliminate all the insecticide sprays, it's to eliminate the superfluous ones. And the superfluous ones are often occurring early in the season where, a grower is spraying to try to prevent risk, but the insect is not even active. And so, they're completely wasting their active ingredient. Or at the end of the year when the population either has stopped developing or it's reached a point where it's not doing damage anymore. So I think an enterprising student or lab could definitely develop a model for woolly apple aphid. In our area, it's more of a secondary pest, and so that hasn't been the main focus. But I think you can develop a phenology model for just about anything if you put your mind to it.
Well, that is some inspiring advice for the development of that model. So thanks so much for chatting with us today, Dave.
No, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, it's Independence Day weekend, and another episode of Scaffolds is coming out for Plant Pathology Edition. Let's see what we have going on this week. We had a nice, cool, dry week, and it looks like we're going to be creeping up every now and then to a few high days, still sprinkled in with a couple maybe slightly cooler ones, but it is getting kind of warmer and drier as we're moving into the heart of July. And I know from a couple of reliable sources that we do have apple powdery mildew out there throughout the industry. And with more and more dry, hot weather, it might be time to kind of integrate some of the mildew control into our summer disease program. We're at a period of time where you might want to manage the various glomerella leaf spot, the Marsanina leaf blight, or apple blotch, as they now call it, bitter rot, black rot, and fly speck sooty blotch. And sometimes a lot of these things can be held at bay with a little bit of Cap-10 and some of the other biologicals, but these single site fungicides, the group 7, 11s, and 3, are really going to bring the hammer down on really tough seasons. So what do we know about apple powdery mildew? We've talked about it plenty on scaffolds, but here are the troublemakers. These primary infections, this is what starts the epidemic off. Young shoots and blossom clusters, depending on what variety you have. My Ida Red often will get flower clusters that explode with powdery mildew, while my Jonna Golds will get a young developing shoot that explodes with powdery mildew and starts sporulating, kicking off the whole epidemic all season long with secondary infections on terminal leaves and failed infections on young fruit. The failed infections on young developing fruit will look like a spider web netted russeting. And if you see something that looks like a netted russeting as opposed to a drip run russeting, you can think, and you see powdery mildew, you probably have a lot of bad powdery mildew. Now, we're going into a phase that if we don't keep the secondary powdery mildew down, we're going to have more primary blighted shoots next spring. In 2025. This thing becomes a really big problem when you have warm, dry periods in the spring. We're having some hot weather. The rain is finally backed off. We had a lot of humidity early on and heat that allowed the powdery mildew to thrive with all the high relative humidity and sort of intermittent heavy storms. We're still getting those heavy storms, putting a lot of water in the environment, and then we get a couple of days of hot, humid weather, and the powdery mildew is loving it. Many of the newer cultivars are not as sensitive or not as susceptible to apple scab, but a lot of them are getting powdery mildew, and a lot of the consumer favored ones to eat and producer favored ones to plant, in turn, often have susceptibility to mildew, particularly things with any golden. Gala is a little bit better. Sometimes Honeycrisp can be devastated by it. Some of my other cultivars, some of the pink ladies and other things like that I have of that in my mixed planting are just wiped out with mildew this year. And if this thing continues to get unmanaged or doesn't get cleaned up, it will move towards harvest and make a small, looks like your tree has been sprayed with fake snow at Christmas. And you can reduce a lot of this, even if you weren't able to get it early on in first to second cover. You can kind of burn these spores out as we're moving into fall. If they get to terminal bud set and the infections are heavy, they will infect the buds for next year, making more of these rather awful primary mildew infections. Do we have fungicide resistance? Not as of a couple of years ago. I just had a student finish with a PhD on apple powdery mildew, and it looks like everywhere in the state is clean. I get a little more worried if we have high populations in our commercial orchards and we're using materials to manage them. However, most of our growers are very good at keeping to that no more than 4 of any one group. And that should keep a lot of the selection down. We're moving away from a period where we're having to rely excessively on one group of fungicides. And in this case, I think it's helping us keep the fungicide resistance in bay. Who knows? Maybe someone will find something in the coming years as the problem becomes more and more endemic. And you can think of the populations getting bigger and more numerous. The chance of a mutation occurring is greater. The best materials out there are DMIs. They were much better in the 1990s. Some of the ones that they had out then, the flutriafol and the myclobutanil, were quite strong against powdery mildew. And are they seemingly a little bit less strong this year? I think there is some quantitative resistance to the DMI fungicides. They're just not as strong as they used to be. Top performer in our rather nasty, we'll call it Jonah Gold powdery mildew blocks, where I can get up to 70 to 90% apple powdery mildew, would be the QOY fungicides. These are group 11, not the group 3. And they're also slightly less effective, but I still cut them as one of my terms of best fungicide group out there. The SDHI's group 7, not as effective, but still fairly strong if you get the right one. The one that's the most water soluble formulations and materials seem to be the strongest in there. I've had some fairly good luck with the Mirabus product, as well as some of the others that I'll talk about as well. Also, we have frequent sulfur applications. If the temperatures stay low and it stays cool, you could probably move back into doing one or two more sulfur applications in the summer. You don't want to do them when it's greater than 85 degrees for very long. So what we've got in our current situation is 7.7. I went back out and looked at all the same things, and it's like what I saw not too long ago. Primary infections are abundant, and all of the highly susceptible cultivars, and secondary infections are claiming the developing terminals. They're going to kind of look stunted if they're been reclaimed. If they burst forth it might even be hard to tell which one's a primary and which one's a secondary, other than by the length of the growth and the development of the leaves. If the leaves have attempted to develop and then curled over later, you can think, oh, they must have gotten claimed. And if they were spindly to begin with and young and they didn't actually develop in the initial stage, you might think of them as being like, oh, that's a primary. But all of these are going to cause trouble, and they're going to cause your terminals next year, and bud infections will occur if they're all allowed to persist in the tree and continue sporulating. Hot, dry weather or humid mornings and evenings, it can be in the 80s, and that will still do it. Humidity in the 80s will really drive these things up into sort of high levels in the susceptible cultivars. If you haven't burned them out already and you're seeing new lesions and new spores that look active, the best products I recommend are that Luna Sensation and Maravon. Their group 7 is fairly good in these two types of products. The 11 is fantastic for these types of things and shouldn't burn them out. Another good option as well would be the potassium bicarbonate. Low potential for injury, decent mildew control. It's what we use in greenhouse and covered environments. And if you have a wet, humid area, it can be kind of covered. Now, sulfur is good as well. If the heat gets hot, maybe don't do it. There's a potential for injury, but if it stays cool and put it on for a little bit and that sulfur will stay there for a while, you can also burn out the mildew with that as well. One of the other things that can happen in some instances is it can be a little tricky to determine whether or not you have powdery mildew or fire blight. Sometimes these things can show up in two plantings, particularly if you have trouble with the heat and heavy rains. Sometimes we're finding the mildew outcompeting fire blight, particularly in inoculated blocks. And the powdery mildew shoots can look a little bit like fire blight and be kind of confusing, and vice versa. So if you're looking for powdery mildew, look for a more spread out leaf, like leaves developed and they became blighted and maybe curled up like a fried calamari. And fire blight, look for the crook and the presence of blighted fruitlets. You won't necessarily see a lot of fruitlets near the powdery mildew shoots, and they'll be sort of more spread out and dipped as if the shoot quit growing. And the fire blight will be crooked, dead. It can still have powdery mildew on your fire blight, but look for those tiny dead fruitlets. That'll be your key for those. Different examples would be, once again, look for the crook, look for the presence of fruitlets, and avoid the ones that look like a mass of spread leaves that are sort of spread apart. If you see the spread apart leaves, you might think mildew. If you see the fruitlets, you might think a little bit of fire blight, mildew, maybe fire blight. And a little bit of, and the mildew can be on the fire blight as well. The good news is if you do get the mildew on the fire blight, it'll stop it. Where are we into the situation? We don't want to do too much around fungicides and green tip. We're in the part of the season where you're going to be using these single sites, trying to get to harvest and burn some of this stuff out. What this is going to do is going to take the exponential growth of your powdery mildew and flatten that growth rate over time with more of these antisporulants, such as the QOI fungicides, those nice group 11s. What we want to avoid is we want to avoid damage to the fruit from all these secondary infections causing the net life russeting, and we want to avoid the developing bugs for next year to be filled with overwintering mycelium and things to be and lead to more primary infection shoots next year. So as you do going through it, if you can get rid of them and you're there and you're seeing one, don't hesitate to cut it out. Any of these things that are heavily blighted, if maybe a whole tree is just so blighted, it could lead to more problems next year. Just remove it in that particular instance. And so where do we leave with this powdery mildew? What you can do is a lot of sanitation in the fall. If you're doing summer pruning and you see mildew and you have crews out there doing that stuff, someone sees it, just don't cut it out. It is an obligate biotroph and cannot survive on the dead tissue. So if you cut it out, all of those things will be dead. It's not necessarily cost effective to specifically go for mildew, but if you're doing other things out there and you see it, just get rid of it. And again, the strongest performers are your groups 11 and your 3s, QOIs and DMIs, and this is where we're moving, trying to get into harvest. Sulfur is great early on when it's not too hot, but if we still have some cool days, you can probably do sulfur and get away with it. You just don't want to lose any fruit and fruit finish damage to powdery mildew if the incidence is high in your orchards. All right, well, see ya after this Independence Day weekend.
And now for the State of the State, your weekly roundup of phenology and degree day accumulations from the major fruit production regions of the state. As always, I'm Anna Wallace with the New York State IPM program at Cornell, and I'll be sharing information aggregated from the regional specialists and my own observations. Over the past week and the holiday weekend, we had some extremely hot, humid conditions across the state with highs in the 80s in most locations and low overnight lows remaining in the 60s. Heat advisories were issued in many places in the Hudson Valley and in some other locations across the state with a real feel up into the upper 90s in a lot of places. This is just a friendly reminder to stay hydrated, keep replenishing electrolytes, and be looking out for your crews and for each other during these heat waves. There was some sporadic rainfall again this week, ranging from 0 to 1 inch of accumulated precipitation, according to NEWA weather stations this past week. Again, most of that was in sporadic storms over the end of last week, over the holiday. So if you were looking for some fireworks, we hope that you got to see them. The U.S. Drought Monitor, which is a product that you can see online, has a great map showing abnormally dry to drought conditions across the country. In the Northeast, we don't have any regions that are at risk at this time, although we have a couple of pockets that are considered abnormally dry. So we'll continue watching that and providing updates. We'll also include a link to that tool in the show notes. Looking at the forecast for the next couple of weeks, it's unfortunately not looking like this weather is going to let up anytime soon. Heat and scattered storms are in the forecast for the rest of this week, with a high-pressure front moving in, bringing more storms again at the beginning of next week, potentially moving in as early as Sunday evening. Both the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks in the NOAA Climate Prediction Center are predicting a lot hotter weather than normal for the next few weeks, with wetter than average conditions as well. The long-term forecast for the rest of the season over the months of July, August, and September is also predicting hotter than average and wetter than average weather. Looking at phenology across the state, we are near terminal bud set on apples in most locations. We said this last week, but we're still seeing some new growth in some places and varieties, especially after all the rain. But looking at close to terminal bud set in most varieties now. Again, it's a really compressed growth season, so we're seeing really similar phenology across the state. Fruit is continuing to color and size very well. Across the state, most people are focusing on cover sprays in between the wet weather and storms of last week and then again expected this week and next week. The Hudson Valley continues to be a little bit ahead of other regions. Apples are sizing extremely well, depending on variety, location, and thinning that was done. Cherries continue harvesting, with early plums also beginning harvest. Peaches and nectarines are sizing very well. An early harvest on the earliest varieties is just beginning. Blueberries, raspberries, and other berries are also beginning to harvest, with earlier varieties harvesting now in the past week or two. We're beginning to see marginal chlorosis in honeycrisp leaves, which is an anomaly to this variety, and doesn't indicate any poor health. It's something we're very familiar with as honeycrisp growers, but it's always a good reminder to me that this is the time of year to be taking leaf foliar samples if you're going to be doing that this year. Also a good time to be doing the peel sap analysis if you're participating in that program. Looking at some upcoming pest events, Oriental fruit moth, we're seeing the second generation peak egg hatch in Hudson Valley and Western New York. So it's time for a cover spray if you haven't had one in the past 10 to 14 days. In the Champlain Valley, the first flight is beginning, but may be a little bit early for an insecticide targeting egg hatch at this time. For codling moth, we continue to see damage in unmanaged areas. Remember that codling moth prefers to feed on the seeds, so you'll see tunneling from the side of the fruit or the calyx end directly to the seeds, where they prefer to feed on the high source of nutrition that the seeds provide. In the Hudson Valley, the biofix for the first generation was May 6th in Highland, and accumulated degree days base 50 since that biofix is 1,250 at this time. So the NEWA prediction model is forecasting the second generation of moths are continuing emergence. In Western New York and the Champlain Valley, we're seeing flight taper for the second generation. Remember, if you had good control of the first generation, you should see less pressure in the second generation. Your first insecticide application should be targeting larvae at 200 to 250 degree days, base 50, after the first catch or biofix for either generation. For oblique banded leaf roller, trap captures continue but taper in most places across the state this week. We are continuing to see terminal and fruit feeding in unmanaged locations, so you can be looking for rolling and webbing of those youngest leaves. Also, fruit feeding just on the skin or under the skin. Look especially in the tops of the canopies and inside compact fruit clusters where they like to hide out. We typically recommend monitoring growth terminals at 600 to 700 degree days, base 43 after the biofix or the first capture in your orchard. Apple maggot trap captures are also continuing across the state this week. In most locations, those trap captures remain fairly low, but in some areas they are reaching above thresholds, so continue to be monitoring at your location to know if you have pressure. This is a fairly sporadic pest where we know that there is very high pressure and high trap captures in some locations, but not in others. Remember that the recommended threshold for management is 5 flies per trap for baited traps. So those traps are the red spheres that are coated in tanglefoot or the sticky material, and then the bait is sort of a pear essence or an ammonium acetate lure that can be purchased to accompany those traps. We are continuing to see some mite outbreaks, both European red mite and 2-spotted spider mite outbreaks in some locations, mostly owing to the very hot weather. They're particularly prone to outbreaks in hot, dry, dusty weather. Now that we've moved into July, if you're sampling and scouting for mites, your threshold for presence-absence on a leaf is 5 mites per leaf. Instructions and a chart for sequential sampling of mites is available in the Cornell guidelines. A few other pests that we're continuing to see include woolly apple aphid. We see active colonies increasing and moving to leaf axils at this point in the season. We're also seeing continued activity by Japanese beetle, stink bugs and brown marmorated stink bugs, as well as apple leaf curling midge in a few isolated locations. Looking at some diseases, we continue to get a few reports of fire blight, but it continues to be relatively on the tame side this year, aside from some known problem areas. So fingers crossed on the fire blight, but keep scouting and making sure that you don't see any strikes in your orchard as we move into this hot weather. Apple scab lesions have continued popping up in some unexpected places, so be looking out for spores that could be contributing to secondary infections. Powdery mildew continues to be fairly severe in a lot of places given the really hot, humid weather. We're seeing primary and secondary infections more prevalent in this continued warm, humid weather. Sooty blotch and fly speck and other rot diseases are at high risk with the rain and wetness during the past few weeks. We haven't seen a lot of infections at this point in time, or at least not a lot of reports of them. Other diseases and disorders that we expect to see more of around this time of year include the yellow leaf blotches and spots, including Marsanina, glomerella, and necrotic leaf blotch. So we're starting to look for those at this time. Looking now at cherries and berries. For spotted winged Drosophila, we are continuing to have trap captures across the state. For this insect, we usually see low trap captures and then quick escalation into high populations. And so in many locations, we are seeing that at this time. To follow trap capture information in your region or your area, you can subscribe to the new Berry Pest Monitoring Network, which reports site-specific location on spotted-winged Drosophila, trap captures, as well as some other berry pests that we've been monitoring this season. There's information on that new blog in the show notes. We've also had a high report of disease incidents in cherries this year, including both blossom blast and brown rot, among other things, mostly related to the very hot, humid conditions, which has led to really good conditions for disease to proliferate this season and cause infections. To help teach some of these orchard scouting protocols and monitoring techniques, we've had 2 virtual orchard scout trainings this season with Mike Bastow, Janet Van Zorn, and myself teaching monitoring and scouting protocols and identification. In case you missed it, both the first and second trainings are now available online on the New York State IPM YouTube website. Mike, Janet, and I reviewed some of the most economically significant diseases in insects, including mite sampling, disease identification, internal LEPs, both codling moth and OFM, plum curculio, woolly apple aphid, apple maggot, apple leaf curling midge, stink bugs, and spotted-winged Drosophila. If you'd like to see those recordings, we're including links to those videos in the show notes. And now here are the current degree day accumulations in major fruit-producing regions of the state. Throughout the season, we've been aligning this information with previous work done by Art Agnello related to Macintosh phenology and degree days, base 43 Fahrenheit. Degree day accumulation through July 8th was in Geneva, 2010, in Highland at the Hudson Valley Research Lab, 2,153, Clifton Park, 2003, Peru, 1,775, Medina, an inland site, 1,952, Appleton North, a lake site, 1,803, Fairville, an inland site, 1,897, Williamson, a lake site, 1,916. That's all for this week, and good luck until next week.